Thank you for joining us. My name is Joe Carr, and I'm happy to welcome you to this Providence College podcast. I've been looking forward to this one for a while, the opportunity to speak with one of my professors from back in the day, Dr. Bill Hudson. Dr. Hudson is the chair of the Political Science Department, a PC professor since 1974. His expertise includes American politics and public policy. Much of our talk focused on his book, American Democracy in Peril, soon to be in its 9th printing. We also talked about the factors that draw today's students to the study of politics and government, and that 1983 senior seminar he taught in his dining room on Smith Street. Bill, I'm always interested in what brought people to PC. So you grew up in Indiana. Your PhD studies brought you to Brown. Take us from there. How did you end up on the PC faculty back in 1974?
Right. I came to Providence in 1970 to study political science at Brown and worked there for a few years. And eventually, when you go to graduate school, you're supposed to actually find employment. So when I went on the job market in 1974, a position was open at Providence College. I didn't know much about PC, even though I'd been in town for a few years. Then, probably more than now, there was a big divide between College Hill, Brown University, and Smith Hill and Providence College. Didn't cross that very often. And so I didn't know much about PC, but there was a position opening, so I applied, and people here were interested. The chair at that time was a memorable fellow named Zygmunt Friedman, Dr. Friedman, and he encouraged my candidacy, and I applied and interviewed, and they offered me the job, and I took it. At the time, my advisor said, well, you know, Bill, going across town to Providence College for a couple of years while you finish your dissertation will be very convenient and a good thing. And here I am 43 years later.
As somebody who became one of your students showing up here in 1979 as a political science major, I can say we're grateful that it happened this way. And what a great faculty group you were surrounded by. You still are. But thinking about the group then, people like Dr. Friedman, Dr. Carlson, Dr. Hyde, Dr. Trudeau, these people who had such a great impact, I should say, on so many students for so long.
Right. That's my cohort most of them have retired by now, and I'll be retiring in a few years myself. But we've got a number of very new, interesting folk who have been hired to replace them. Young folks, millennials most of all.
Right.
I'm learning about how to relate to millennials by relating to my political science colleagues. And they're all really good scholars and really exciting teachers. So I think they are filling the shoes of their predecessors in political science.
A dramatic understatement to say it's worked out well 43 years later, but I'm struck to note how busy and involved you are now. You're in faculty leadership, you're the department chair, your scholarship and your teaching are very active. What is it that motivates you? What drives you?
Well, one of the things at this point, having been at the institution so long, I'm very, very interested in what happens at Providence College, not only in my department, but in the college as a whole, and want to contribute what I can, before I leave the college, to making sure that it becomes a better and better college. One of the things that is clear, after 40 some years is it's interesting to see how much the college has improved. Because it was I think a fine academic institution when I first arrived, but it's just gotten better and better over the years. And particularly in the last decade or so, I think we've really taken off in terms of the quality of the faculty across the board, the quality of our student body, the physical plan at the college. People see the new buildings going up, and it's really a quite exciting time to be at Providence College, and I want to continue to be a part of that. Also, I'm very concerned about the quality of education for our students, what kind of learning goes on here, and to the extent whatever I do can improve that learning atmosphere, I find that very satisfying.
Let's talk a bit about this book, American Democracy in Peril. First published in 1993. In it, you describe 8 challenges to America's future. And the word predictive is one that you used, and it comes to mind when I look at this book now. You picked out back then 8 areas. And let me read them. I hate to take up this time, but I think it's worth it. The first challenge, separation of powers, followed by the Imperial Judiciary, radical individualism, citizen participation, elections without the people's voice, the, quote, privileged position of business, economic inequality, the national security state. All things still very much in the public discussion. How did you arrive at this list? How did this come together?
Well, I wanted to consider, back in 1993, the sorts of things that could threaten the stability of our democracy in the long run. That certain areas where there were certain trends going on that were disturbing from a democratic point of view, that prevented people from participating effectively in their own governance, which is the heart of democracy. And so I kind of thought about various things. I guess I'll bring up the seminar that you participated in 1983. In the 1980s, along with my colleague Bob Trudeau, we had taught a seminar called Challenges to Democracy. And we had examined a variety of topics. And each one of those, at some point in the several years we did the seminar, had been a topic of the seminar. And I kind of looked through those topics and picked the ones that I thought could form a coherent book. Of course, I was also interested in marketing issues. I wanted to write a book that people would actually buy and read. And one of the things I was thinking about was were the typical topics that political scientists covered in an introductory American government course. That is, what are the kinds of things you talked about? And to some extent, the challenges are picked to relate to particular topics. For example, the first challenge, separation of powers, well, that relates to our constitutional structure. Every American politics class in America starts with the Constitution, Declaration of Independence, and the Constitution. And separation of powers is clearly a very important part of that. And from my point of view, it's interesting because although we tend as Americans to think that separation of powers is kind of central to democracy, the chapter argues about how our separation of power structures can in fact impede accountability, can impede responsiveness, can get in the way of democracy. And as the chapter points out, that was in fact intended by the framers when they wrote the Constitution. But in this day and age, it in fact evolved in such a way that it really impedes democratic practice. So that was the kind of thing that I thought about in picking each of the topics.
Well, it's certainly endured, and we'll talk about the 9th printing in a moment, but to go back to that seminar, what a perfect antidote that was to senioritis. This is my last semester, and the thing I remember many things about it, but one thing that strikes me is how patient Mrs. Hudson was with 6 or 8 of us showing up in your dining room on Smith Street on Thursday afternoons or whatever day of the week it was, which is where you taught much of this, and it was wonderful, and it was a great experience for all of us who had that opportunity.
Yeah, and well, I'm glad you mentioned senioritis because one of the things about the seminar was that Bob and I selected books that were intended to provoke. They weren't going to be the run-of-the-mill, dull analysis of politics, but a book that would sort of challenge what the received wisdom that students had about American democracy. And I hope that idea has worked its way into the book. The book is intended to be challenging and to provoke and to make the readers think about kind of the conventional received wisdom about democracy and American politics that they have.
You're updating the book now for the 9th time, and considering the tumultuous times in which we live, is it particularly challenging, or perhaps just the opposite, particularly interesting at this time to be refreshing these ideas?
Well, it's both, actually. It's very interesting, but very, very challenging. I'm in fact somewhat nervous about taking on the task of revision. In the past, revising has mainly been a process of updating information and data, sharpening the arguments a bit, updating anecdotes in the book. But with Donald Trump, we have something that's quite different in American politics. Surprising, but I think reflective of trends that we've seen in American politics for a while. But it's certainly going to be a challenge to try to integrate into the book the new kinds of problems and issues that have come to the fore in the past year. In fact, for the first time, I'm actually thinking about restructuring the book significantly, perhaps adding 2 or 3 chapters. I have over the years added one chapter, the Judiciary chapter, the 8th challenge, was added probably in the 4th or 5th edition. But I'm thinking now that I need to restructure some of these challenges to accommodate what's been going on in the last year. And we can talk about that more in a minute if you like.
Sure. By the way, we'll list the 8 challenges in the show notes so that you can go back and refer to those if you would like to see what they are. And of course, the book is available too, and it's a terrific read for people interested in our government and our democracy. I'd like to focus, though, for a minute, Bill, on one of the challenges, and that's economic inequality. In the book, you write about economic inequality as a threat to the American dream, and that it's even worse with regard to minority populations. Take us through that connection between economic inequality, all that goes with it, and how that threatens democracy.
Okay, I must say that this chapter, I'm very interested in it personally because it reflects, I guess, my dismay as I got older in my life in seeing America move in a direction that would have been totally unthinkable when I was a young person. When I was a young man, I think the assumption was, I grew up in the 1950s and 60s, a time of decreasing inequality, a time in which the standard of living rose very rapidly for Americans pretty much across the board. In fact, between 1947 and the early 1970s, the lower end of the income distribution, the sort of bottom 20% of income earners, saw their incomes grow to a greater extent than people at the top. And I think I grew up in an environment in which I assumed that's the way the world worked, that over time, the poor got richer and the the income of the rich was moderated, so that there was going to be a balance in the living standards of everyone. And not that I ever suspected there'd be total equality. That's never, I think, the goal or objective of those who want to see less inequality, but that the difference between the rich and the poor would not be so great that people in different classes would regard the others as living a completely different kind of life. That there was a kind of common life that Americans could assume of adequate access to the material basics of life. And there's going to be differences, but they aren't going to be so great that we would regard each other as living in different countries, in effect. And already in the 1980s, it was clear, there was quite considerable data that this growing equality or declining inequality had reversed sometimes in the 70s. This is common knowledge now, I think, in America. The idea of growing inequality is talked about a lot in the media, et cetera. But at the end of the 1980s, early 1990s, when I was writing the book, people weren't talking about the growing inequality that much. But I noticed it, and I found it very disturbing. And I felt that it did kind of undermine the American dream. The notion that even if you grow up in a poor family, you can aspire to a comfortable life in the future, and that there's going to be progress in that direction. It's certainly very much connected to democracy because, going all the way back to someone like Aristotle in the classical age, there was always political observers always saw a connection between having a nice middle class, a society where there weren't extremes of wealth and poverty, as being crucial for a good political system, and certainly important for democracy. And so when I wrote this chapter, I was responding very much to my own personal experience, but also what was becoming clearer and clearer in the data. It's certainly a problem for democracy because democracies do require that we relate to each other as citizens. And if, as citizens, our life experiences are so dramatically different that we can't even understand or talk about issues and understand the way they might affect the lives of other people, I think it becomes very difficult to have a democratic discussion. And I think we're seeing this right now. Inequality has only worsened since the first edition of this book came out in 1993. We're all aware now of the discussion of the 1% and the like. And I think we are seeing a situation where the very wealthy in our society, the top 10% of the income distribution, just live very different lives than probably the bottom 50 or 60%. What they face on a day-to-day basis, the extent to which many Americans, I would say nowadays probably most Americans, experience some economic insecurity in their life, have to worry about losing a job and the impact that has. We know that most Americans now have a very small savings cushion to rely upon if something bad happens, an illness or some other a divorce, some other life circumstance that would disrupt the income flow. And so their experience of life is very different than people who are in the sort of top 10, 5% and above, who do have those savings cushions, who do have resources they can draw upon in extremes. And so when you have a discussion about a public policy, whether it's taxes or a program like Social Security or healthcare, it's difficult for people at the extremes of the income distribution to understand how this policy might affect the other. And that's become difficult. The other problem with inequality is that that inequality has clearly bled over into the political system and the ability of people to exercise influence in the political system. It's pretty clear, and I get into some data in the book, that government officials are much, much more responsive to people and the concerns of people in the top of the income distribution than they are at the bottom or even in the middle. So that we have this inequality has grown to the extent now that some people argue that America has become virtually an oligarchy, where the very wealthy dictate the policies, and they're the people that government officials have to listen to. And there's a lot in the book that sort of spells that out and shows how not only economic inequality itself, but the way elections operate, the changes in the campaign finance system and the like, really give more clout to wealthier Americans. And that's not democratic. A democratic system is one reflected in the notion of one person, one vote, where everybody has, at some basic level, a kind of equal say about what happens. And I don't think that's the case in America today.
So that gives our listeners a sense of the depth to which you explore each of these conditions that challenge democracy, and the format also involves the suggestion of policy remedies to help ameliorate some of these conditions. And in this case, with respect to economic inequality, you advocate in your book for a new progressive era. Do you see, that picks up on the progressive era, of course, from the early 20th century, do you see forces at play that could lead our society in a direction like that?
I hope so. The last time in American history where we had the kinds of extremes we're seeing now was the end of the 19th century, the famous Gilded Age, as Mark Twain called it, of the 1890s and early 20th century. And that's when you saw this emergence of a progressive movement that created government institutions that were intended to ameliorate that. It was a long process. I think the New Deal, which came along in the 1930s, it was a great follow-on to the progressive era. Franklin Roosevelt himself, his political career began as a progressive in New York, and he certainly had acquired that outlook and the like, and that carried over in the New Deal, so that you saw in the 1930s, both in the teens with Theodore Roosevelt and Wilson, and then later in the 30s with FDR, a number of political reforms that tried to attack these economic divides and create supports for ordinary Americans so that they could succeed materially, and required drawing on the resources of the very wealthy, increasing taxes on the rich. The income tax was instituted in the progressive era, and it at first only applied to the very, very wealthy. And of course, in the 1930s, to the complaints of many of the malefactors of great wealth, as Roosevelt called them, the wealthy didn't like the fact that their taxes went up in the 30s and in the 40s, and well into the tax system really was much more progressive and drew more on the wealth of the rich to provide support for programs for the rest of society, through the 50s and 60s. So yes, to get to your question, a long prelude, that's what we professors do. We are now in a situation where we have levels of inequality that are equivalent at least to those of the 1920s. One would think that something has to be done. Can we allow this to continue? I think going down that road is a very dark journey indeed. Growing inequality is not going to result in good outcomes. And so what do? You need some reforms that can rebalance the scales, can create more opportunity for those in the middle and those at the bottom, and that could revive the kind of American dream and democracy we would all expect and want. There are some signs in that you see movements of people demanding change. The success of Bernie Sanders was certainly one part of that, but even beyond that, you see various movements developing of trying to find ways of ameliorating inequality, and even conservatives and some Republicans, a segment of the Republican Party, has begun talking seriously about this as an issue. It's not just coming from the left. That even conservatives realize that the levels of inequality that we have today are just not sustainable, and things need to be done to balance things out. So I'm hopeful that in the coming years we're going to see more progressive policies adopted. It's going to be a struggle. The politics of the progressive era were not smooth and clear. They involved a lot of controversy and struggle, and certainly the politics in the 1930s were like that. But hopefully these movements will develop over time.
And again, the name of the book is American Democracy in Peril by Professor Bill Hudson of the Providence College Political Science Department. Let's talk a little bit about today at PC in that department. Professor Hudson, and today's students, what is it that motivates their curiosity about government and politics?
Well, in the last year, Donald Trump has been a major factor. In fact, we've seen our the number of poli-sci majors go up considerably in the last year, and I call it the Trump effect. That he certainly has called attention to politics, and students react in various ways. I think a lot of students simply have suddenly begun to realize that politics can make a difference, that who holds office, who wins elections does matter, and that if you are interested in what's going to happen, you better pay attention. You better get interested. A lot of our students, I think, also are attracted to politics because they're very interested in the global world. We find a lot of students who are very interested in international relations, in politics around the world. Many of our students have traveled around the world. I'm kind of astounded at the extent to which our students have been to other countries, not in Europe, Asia, Africa. And when you go to another country and see politics in places like that, and you come home, that kind of sparks your interest in, well, why are things different there than here? How can we understand that? And also, I think students are just very interested in engaging in the world, and they know that understanding politics is helpful and important to that.
Has the discussion with students changed? And what I'm thinking of is the ways in which we all consume information now. So the way that students, as before they come to PC, develop their understanding of the world around them, they're influenced by media. We have access to more information than any society has ever had before, but much of it is discussed in, to use the cliche, echo chambers. Does that flavor the perspectives of students as they come to college now?
To some extent, although I do agree that the echo chamber effect, the fact that we tend to talk to people who we agree with, and that we consume media that reinforces our views. The evidence is pretty clear that's what happens in America today. But I find the students at Providence College pretty open-minded. However, they come to school wanting to learn about different ideas and different points of view, and we get students who come from different parts of the ideological spectrum. Sometimes it's said that somehow colleges are nowadays are dominated by liberals. They're kind of bastions of liberalisms, and conservative students can't express their views. I don't think that happens at Providence College, at least in the classes that I know of in political science and elsewhere. That they're pretty open discussions and the like. It is clear that this new social media has affected the lives of the current students. Our current students, the iPhone came out about 2010, so our students were about 10 years old, 10 or 11 years old. So they've lived their whole life with a phone and instant access to information, and that certainly has an impact. I don't think all of it good. I think to some extent our students are perhaps too reliant on access to information, that they think they can find the answers on the internet somewhere instead of stopping and thinking. And that's one of the things we want to get them to do in class, is to say, this isn't a question that you're going to be able to Google. You're not going to be able to find the answer by just Googling it. You're going to have to sit down and think through the problem and figure it out. That Googling is simply going to provide a cacophony of different points of views. It's not going to help. And so you have to work with students in that way, I think, now. But by and large, I'm impressed with our students at Providence College, and they're a great group to work with, and they're really eager to learn. And those who come to political science classes are really interested in learning about politics and talking about politics.
Today's podcast is a bit of a trial run for you in a sense. You have this idea of developing a political science podcast, which we're excited about working with you to develop. Tell us more what you're thinking about there.
Yeah, well, I've become a consumer of podcasts in the last few years. I discovered them, I guess, 2 or 3 years ago, and I find myself listening to lots of interesting podcasts. And it occurred to me one day that maybe this is something that the political science department could do. We have a faculty who are very knowledgeable about a variety of different issues, political issues. We cover the world. We have Middle Eastern experts and Chinese politics experts and experts in Latin America, experts on environmental issues, on all kinds of public policy issues, people who know a lot about the operation of American political institutions or what's going on in the Supreme Court. And it occurred to me that we could develop a podcast in which our faculty would, on a regular basis, talk about current issues, drawing upon their expertise. And that would be a way of showcasing, what our faculty know, and also a way of educating the broader public about important public issues. Also creates learning opportunities for students who could become involved as well in either being interviewers or even talking about their own expertise. One of the hallmarks of Providence College is that we create opportunities for students to get engaged in their own research, in developing knowledge themselves, and a podcast would provide an opportunity to talk to students about their research projects and what they've learned, and get it out there on the internet. And maybe we'd get some listeners, people who would actually tune in and want to find out what the political scientists at Providence College are thinking and talking about.
I have no doubt that will happen, and we look forward to working with you to develop that. It's a good idea. Stay tuned. It's certainly not going to be anything immediate, but we have some long-term ideas about working that out, and it's got great potential. So good idea, and thank you for that. And thank you for joining us today. As I mentioned at the beginning, this has been fun for me to think back about learning from you in the classroom, and having the ability to continue to learn from you today is a great thing. Thanks for your time today.
Thank you, Joe. It's a pleasure.
Our guest has been Professor Bill Hudson from the Political Science Department here at Providence College. Thank you for joining us today. You can subscribe to the Providence College podcast at all the usual places, and they're available on the college's YouTube channel. Feedback is welcome at podcast@providence.edu. Thanks to our producer, Chris Judge. I'm Joe Carr. Until next time.